So I love that Chen Chen Stui is the name of our gathering together, and I'm so glad to talk about moving forward and cultural humility and respect. I've been, over the 13 years that I've worked in Indigenous public health, been learning exactly what those mean, and I'm really happy to share some thoughts with you. So if you'll indulge me on that, that's wonderful. I'm from Tla'amin Nation, which is near the town of Powell River. This is where I grew up. This is where I live, and this is where I work from. In the time of COVID, people aren't going into their offices, and I'm not going to Ottawa to work. I'm getting to stay home, and my dad lives and my mom live just over there. Living in my own territory is really a privilege, and I feel quite lucky. And every day I hear stories about the people who used to live here. My great-grandmother used to live like just there, maybe about 20 meters from here. And on that island is where my great-great-grandfather was buried. And then there's a small graveyard now next to the church over there. And my sister is there. And it was actually the death of my sister when I was a boy that drove me to become a physician. I'm a GP, but I have a master's in public health, and I've worked in public health for 13 years. And I've been very lucky to be a part of the movement in BC, which is quite famous in the rest of Canada. The movement in BC where Indigenous peoples participate in their own circle of care. And how is that gone, and how does that feel, and what are the lessons learned for all of us? Because BC has 100,000 healthcare workers. The federal government has quite a number as well. And of course, First Nations peoples, our 200 or so villages, and our Métis communities, and even the about 1,600 Inuit people who live in this province have workers who work directly with them and their families and communities. And I think that Canada is waking up to its history, to that it wasn't just an empty land and then Europeans arrived 200 years ago, but that this continent has Indigenous roots, that the country of Canada is now here, and we are reconciling or bringing together who we thought we were and finding out who we are. So when we have a death like the death of Joyce Echaquan a couple of weeks ago that filled us with so much horror, where we had to look in the mirror and say to ourselves, unfortunately, bad care exists and racism does exist, and sometimes people get hurt within our system. How can we do better? And so for those of you who are nurses in the audience, I'm sure it must have been staggering to know that one of your own would breach her oath and her code of conduct and be so unsafe and racist with a fellow Canadian, with an Indigenous person. So let's go to slide number 5. Okay, if one of you can, or do I have possession of my deck? Thank you. So I grew up in a very traditional way. I had a very strong father, which made me rich. My father was orphaned, and he was raised by his maternal grandmother. And my father's grandmother was born in 1860, and she raised him. He was born in 1936. So he really knew our ways, and he was, he didn't raise me with a gentle hand. he said, you have to be strong. You have to be able to withstand hunger and cold, and you have to be physically strong. Like, he would make me run. Even when I was like 9 or 10, I would have to run on the trails and the road, and I would have to run in cold weather. And he would make me swim in cold water, which for us is a way to build strength. So in the winter, I would have to swim, and he insisted that we be humble. And these, as a kid in the 70s, I really just wanted to watch like Gilligan's Island and be like other boys. I didn't know that this old way of being would be at all useful or important. I just thought it was weird and really old-fashioned, and it was a pain. It was a pain to go out and collect food and to sleep on the beach and sleep between logs, and killing animals and carrying them home. To me, it was hard work. But I'm very grateful for it now, because along the way, it wasn't just the physical activity, where it was the ideas that were behind them. And along the way, I found out that I could read a book and I could remember, and I avoided my responsibility of having to look after people by becoming an actor. I thought being an actor would be really fun. It wasn't as much of a drag as having to look after a whole village. It wasn't as much work as learning our language and learning our spiritual ways, which are quite fierce. It really was easier to sit on the couch and eat ding-dongs and do homework. It really was much, much easier than that. So later in life, in my 30s, I thought, I'm going to be 35 anyway. I might as well get a medical degree. My best friend was a doctor. I applied to medicine and became a doctor, and it was quite a painful experience, one that's taken me a long time to talk about. But I think it's important to talk about our training, and I mean all of us who are health professionals or paraprofessionals or healthcare workers or caregivers. It's important for us to think about how we were made, how we were formed, how we were trained. It's important for us to look back. I acknowledge, for instance, that growing up in the 70s on a reserve gave me a very particular point of view. I know that I had more opportunities than my sisters because Canada in the 70s and reserves in the 70s were sexist. I came out quite early as a gay man. I was 18, I guess, maybe 1984, just as HIV was rearing its ugly head. And so the idea of caring for people was formed in that crucible. And I think it's important for us to reflect back that the system that trained you, however long ago that was, probably excluded Indigenous people and probably privileged men, and probably was part of the residential school system, Indian hospitals, TB sanatoriums, and probably your profession wasn't very egalitarian or wasn't very concerned with health equity or achieving equal outcomes for all populations in Canada. I'm not being insulting. I don't think I'm suppositioning. I think that if you look back, you'll see that your training system was flawed, that the society you grew up in was less than perfect, and that we are products of those, and we have to be woke. We have to wake up to an evolving, new and different day, and it is a challenge. So let's go to the next slide. And I learned that I needed to bring more than my training to my work. And I hope that you've learned that as well. That you are not an empty vessel that was filled by your professional training, that you brought your humanity, that you brought your discipline, you brought your brains, your cultural values, your inherent values, your personality and ideas to your work. And I certainly found in working with Indigenous populations that I had to be a good human being, which is what my Indigenous training, my Indigenous life was about. Be a humble, authentic, hardworking, principled, strong person, and bring that to medicine. And I know for many of you that you have values that came from your own cultures of origin that I hope serve you well. And I hope that you have the insight to analyze your culture of origin or your country of origin or your family of origin and say, you know, there are some things that I have learned that I need to unlearn and pick up new. Go to the next slide. Great. And in the midst of all this, I was doing what we're all doing, trying to keep my balance, because none of you just want to be a good worker. You want to be healthy. You want to be a good parent or a good partner. You want to have happy thoughts and have extraordinary experiences and not just be a worker. And that you want to have time to yourself, and that you are probably creative, and there are probably passions in you that make your life worth living, and you have to pursue those. And probably it's coming to a head now in the time of COVID. Probably many of you are working so unbelievably hard that it's hard to keep one's balance. In the midst of that was, you know, I'm remembering our way, which is always to remember others around you, to bring your family with you. Fix your family is something that I heard my father say over and over and over again. Fix your family. You have a responsibility that's so much bigger than just what's going on in your head. And of course, if you're a really sophisticated person, you can actually do more than just look after your family. You can look after an extended family, or you can look after a community or a hospital or a clinic, or you know, some other things. Right? So the challenge that we've inherited then, this world that we've inherited, where there are these phenomenal health disparities, where Indigenous peoples come in last of any ethnic group in all socioeconomic indicators, particularly in health outcomes, that the difference in the health outcomes of Indigenous peoples or First Nations peoples, in this case, I made this slide when I was with the First Nations Health Authority, is unacceptable. It's unethical. I think it's actually immoral. Protect disparities. I'm just thinking south of us and how many people protect what they have at the expense of others. And what is our role in making sure that there are equal outcomes for all our patients? Some of you have heard me describe before meeting a new health minister, and we're briefing him and describing to him that we are somewhat responsible for transgendered health. And he looked at me a bit strangely and he said, "We're in charge of that?" And I said, "Yes, sir, we serve all British Columbians." And it was a painful moment where I saw myself, where I recognized how easy it is to say, I only want to treat the people I like, and not bother with anyone else. And I see every year with the health trainees that I encounter how some of them disapprove of certain portions of the patients that they serve, and they get lazy. Or even negligent, even worse than negligent. They can be disrespectful to patients that they don't approve of. They're from a group that they have difficulty seeing the humanity in. And I inherited this world. We inherited this world where First Nations people are not the only ones inside their circle of care. It's not just brown people looking after brown people. That in fact, the care team around brown people, the majority of them are not brown people, or they're not Indigenous. If we could change the slide, that'd be great. And so how do we, as workers, integrate that we are part of a large circle of people around a patient, a client, a family, who are working for their well-being? I feel like if we could all recognize the team a bit better, that we would be more humble, that we would remember that others are watching us. We are working together to help someone be well. And I just think of a simple concept like a young woman is in a car accident and she has a brain injury and she has trouble going to school, and how that affects her little brother, and how her mom has to change her schedule to help care for her, and how Dad has to work in a different way and make a kind of income, and how Grandma is pulled in. Can you help with this? Can you help with that? And how the young woman might need rehab or speech therapy, or if it's an Indigenous client, the elders would say, let us help in some way, shape, or form. Let us send people over, maybe a sports coach or a cultural person. You know that there are a lot of people who would be helping the family. Next slide. And we are compelled to learn our history. I'm amazed how ignorant some people I encounter are. Just, very casually, they'll say things like, "Oh, you're an Indian. I hear you get stuff for free." And it's just such an odd attitude. And I think, wow, if that's what you see when you see me, that's very strange. Like, do you know about Columbus? This is Columbus's arrival in Hispaniola, and how he encountered the Taino people, and how the Taino people were decimated by Columbus's land hunger, and he enslaved part of the population, that he killed several hundred people to try and make the rest of the population bend to his will, that he was sent on a mission to try and make money. It wasn't a great voyage of scientific discovery, or maybe it was in small part, but for us, I mean, at least we can acknowledge us, this coming together of two worlds meant momentous change, many of it not good. And that for us, as Indigenous peoples, we remember conflict. We remember how, after contact, we went from owning everything to being pushed to the margins, living on the edges of dominant culture, of losses, of disempowerment. This is a slide of Captain James Cook. Captain Cook, when he went to the Hawaiian Islands, kidnapped an ali'i, an elder called Kalani Opu'u. He tried to force the Hawaiians to help him with his ship repairs. By kidnapping this elder, he was killed. So he died on the Big Island. For those of you who know Hawaii, in Kona Coast on the Big Island. For Hawaiians, this is very real, and I'm purposely putting it outside of us. I don't think many of you are probably from Hawaii who are in the audience, but certainly from your position, you must see that there used to only be Hawaiians on Hawaii, and now there are many other people there, and that movement from who they were to where they find themselves now was This is my great-grandfather. His name was Atam. He was blinded by a smallpox epidemic in 1871. He was born in 1870. The smallpox epidemic started in San Francisco, whipped up the coast both ways, all the way up to Alaska as it headed north, and it killed about a third of the native people on the coast of BC in the space of 7 months. And those it didn't kill, it blinded. My great-grandfather went on to have 8 children, in spite of being blinded as an infant. He was a woodcutter. And in this slide is the very top of the picture, right in the middle, is my mother in residential school, where she went from being in a TB hospital. She left when she was 5. Right into residential school, and she stayed there until she finished grade 12. That separation from her village and from her parents and from her father was something she would, my mother was a very still person. She's still a very quiet person. That shaped her, and she learned to be quiet. She learned to be meek. And to this day, she still cries over those things that happened to her, even though she is very strong. So these experiences that shaped Canada and Indigenous peoples are very real to me. They're not just ideas. And so when someone very flippantly says, "Oh, you should get over that," I don't feel anger so much as, "Oh, wow, you're really, really naive." I don't want to say dumb. Yeah, I want to say dumb. I just want to say you have really no idea what you're talking about, do you, when you say, "Get over that." Fine. So all of those Indigenous realities shaped me. Like I said, I skipped traditional training, which was to serve the people. I became an actor. It was pretty fun and silly work, but I had a wonderful time, and I tried to tell Indigenous stories. It was time to go back to school and get my medical degree, and here's a photo of me just as I was graduating. I had long hair, and at St. Paul's Hospital in downtown Vancouver, I looked exactly like this, with a dress shirt, a tie, a white jacket, and a stethoscope. And as soon as I got there, within 5 minutes, a doctor had called security and said, "There's an Indian in the doctor's lounge." And Canada is trying to reconcile what has happened in its past with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Go to the next slide. Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a recording of human rights abuses against what was then Indigenous children. They're now adults. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission ran for 6 years and recorded over 6,000 testimonials of children's experiences in those schools. And if someone says to me, "Get over residential schools," I know they haven't listened to any of those 6,000 testimonials, haven't listened to even one, because you just need to hear one, let alone 10 or 20 or 100, before you feel great compassion for what happened. Right. And that's my parents actually met in residential school, and my mother would not give her testimonial to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Her identifying people from residential school that she remembered. So she didn't make it to her for recording, so my mother's experience is not in their archives. Slide. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission gave us many calls to action, and you may have reviewed these today already. Number 22 is we call upon those who can affect change within the Canadian healthcare system to recognize the value of Aboriginal healing practices and use them in the treatment of Aboriginal patients in collaboration with Aboriginal healers and elders where requested by Aboriginal patients. And I'm just remembering when we had a gathering for First Nations people who were on a cancer journey and how they all, almost to a person, used traditional medicine because that's what they had grown up with. You know, cancer is more a disease of the aged, of elders. And many of them had grown up with traditional knowledge, and they were happy with traditional medicine. They wouldn't put them away. It doesn't matter how you say it or how you put it. They want traditional medicines. It was, to me, as a Western-trained physician, a revelation. I thought our people were more co-opted than that. I thought they had been assimilated or acculturated more than that, but they haven't. Call to action number 23, we call upon all levels of government to increase the number of Aboriginal professionals working in the healthcare field, ensure the retention of Aboriginal healthcare providers in Aboriginal communities, and provide cultural competency training for all healthcare professionals. This is very interesting because I know a lot of Aboriginal healthcare professionals, and to a person, they will say that it was a very difficult experience that was often discouragingly racist. When I was the residency director at UBC, I've just filled in for a mat leave. I wasn't there for long, just several months. 31 out of 32 of the Indigenous medical students reported very discouraging racist incidents. So to me, racism in healthcare training is inevitable, and so we must be prepared for that. And if we are lucky enough to be healthcare professionals, have the ability to teach, we must be aware. What are we saying to our trainees? What are they saying back to us? How are we teaching them? What are we hearing from them when we meet with, say, Aboriginal clients? And today, in a room full of 300 people at our national summit, many of them were Indigenous physicians and nurses, and they, many of them cried with how painful that experience. With this slide, I just wanted to remind myself and remind us that we still live with these impacts, that we still have Indigenous clients who are being treated poorly in emergency rooms. We still have a lot of children who are being apprehended. We still have a lot of families broken apart where family members are incarcerated. We still have a number of complaints about what occurs within the healthcare system. And these are, I think, a direct hangover and a direct result of the world that we came from, what we inherited from the time of Columbus or time of the TB epidemics and residential schools. Right. And so part of our work then is not just to help Indigenous clients or patients, but to help Indigenous learners. And I would like to encourage all of you to help with training Indigenous students. We have been historically excluded. So part of reconciliation is welcoming Indigenous workers into our circle and understanding that they are unique and they are different. I remember on the very first day of medical school, and we went right into the anatomy lab, how I was trained to deal with dead people or bodies was different than the white woman, the white Canadian beside me. We were just different. It wasn't that I had superior teachings to her about how to be with the dead. Just a uniqueness. And so for all of you who are training Indigenous learners, there may be a differentness, which I think is actually exciting, but for some may be very troubling. Next. And we have our own ways of being and knowing and doing. That's very interesting. And let's tell you a quick story of having a son. I told you my dad taught me in a very strict way, and I had my own son who liked to sleep in. I said to my dad, I find myself screaming at him every day, and I don't like it. I think I might just leave him be and just let him sleep. Dad said, that's not our way. Our way is our way, and you have to learn it. You don't make it up. You have to learn it. And then I realized that my culture, or Indigenous cultures, require knowledge and rigor and memorization and exercises, and you have to think about them and ingest them, and they become the meanings within them become more and more real. So for us, our holistic approach to health and well-being is something that I constantly go back to. Like, for instance, everything is connected. Rather than being very specific with my work, I can explode it outwards and be a generalist in action and in thought. We also learn about cultural humility, that we can be humble, we can know our place when it comes to others. A simple idea being, I help to deliver babies. And I was teaching a woman how to push on her next contraction, and she said, how do you know about having a baby? I said, well, I don't really know. Of course, I've never actually had a baby myself. My learning is vicarious. It's by being near people who are giving birth. And she said, yeah, you don't know, do you? And I said, no. And I almost started to mansplain to her what I did know about birth, and I stopped myself, and I had to accept that a man's experience of childbirth is different from a woman's, period. And I just had to be humble and suck that up. Safety means us digging deeper, I think, or at least I'm realizing, digging deeper than where I thought we had to go. That the lack of cultural safety for Joyce Echaquan directly contributed to her death, directly contributed to this broken family that I've just met and watched her family cry for the loss of her. That safety is not just saying hello in a traditional language, or not having really simplistic generalizations about other races. That cultural safety is about examining the whole of the system. That it really is anti-racism work. Can we talk about how we arrived at this? Can we talk about how a woman can die in our emerge? Like what happened? And this is a slide to remind me about racism encountered by Indigenous workers. So it's not something that we talk about enough yet, but I think we will, especially with the new inquiry here in BC about racism and Indigenous-specific racism in the healthcare system. So as an Indigenous leader, I was meeting with other physician leaders, And within a few minutes of arriving at a meeting, one of the physician leaders, who looked a lot like this, came up to me and said, you guys get everything. You should give your budget, your money, to immigrants. And I hate being schooled by non-Indigenous people about Indigenous health. It's really a trigger for me. A white person screaming at me about what Native people need to do makes me mad. So I was pushing back. So she was screaming at me. I was screaming at her. People jumped between us like we were actually physically brawling. And it was like one of the most horrible moments of my career. I thought, what was that? Someone almost jumped me. That was craziness. And and from hearing from other healthcare professionals, this kind of aggression against Indigenous academics and Indigenous healthcare professionals, Indigenous administrators, paraprofessionals working on the ground as they hand off to medical teams happens, and that kind of constant push against us is hurtful, and it limits us, and it's a different kind of burden that we then carry that's different from other healthcare workers. So, the only thing I want to talk about on this slide is respect. It shocked me that someone would not see me, that this physician, instead of thinking, oh, Evan Adams knows a lot about Indigenous health, she got in my face and told me exactly what she thought about Indigenous health. And it reminded me of how often I didn't get just a simple respect from others, that they would be on me and they were being toxic. To me, that's a lack of respect. And so I wonder, and I don't know the answer to this, I wonder what role a lack of respect plays in toxic behaviors or racist behaviors. So, humility or humbleness, self-reflection, something from the worker, not from the client, but from the worker, the ability to self-reflect and to say, I'm working from a particular position. I can own it, and I can define it, and I can, for instance, say, I'm a man, I'm not a woman. My experience of childbirth is different. I'm a physician, I'm privileged compared to someone else. Sometimes I need to stop talking. You probably want me to stop talking soon. But humility is knowing one's place. And literally just yesterday, I was trying to find a way to intervene on a non-Indigenous nurse leader who was schooling one of our top Indigenous researchers about Indigenous health. She was schooling her, yelling at her, interrupting her, and saying, this is how it works. This is what you need to do, and doing it in a very aggressive and unfriendly tone. And she had no insight. And I was trying to find a way, and I hope you have a way of interrupting someone who's on a rant like that and saying, stop schooling her. Not helpful. Stop this. Because if you can't interrupt her, in a way your silence feels complicit. I felt complicit. I was like, how do I stop this? How do I stop this screaming? So cultural humility really is respect. It's very simple. And our lack of safety when we're at our worst as workers is us diminishing, demeaning, disempowering someone based on their cultural inheritance. So if you find yourself diminishing or demeaning or disempowering someone, you may be on the wrong end of the argument. I think of because I worked for a very brief time in Children's Emerge, and I was amazed how many parents I would catch yelling at their injured children, saying, "What the hell is wrong with you? What were you thinking?" And I would have to say, "Could you just like save that for later, and let's focus on your child feeling better?" Next slide. And so we are charged with transformation, with change. And I know for all of you, change is exciting, but it's hard. Next slide. But I'm asking you to do it. So, and I'm asking you to find out how to do it, because I don't have all the answers. So if one of your colleagues was looking after Joyce Echequan, what would you do? How would you stop that interaction? How many of you, and please don't put your hands up, how many of you have had situations where a patient was being belittled or a coworker was being unsafe and something bad was happening in front of you? How did you protect them? How did you enact safety? How did you demand safety afterwards? How did you begin that conversation? Like, I'm even having trouble asking you, have you seen racism in the healthcare? What did you do about it? Talk amongst yourselves. Next slide. Just me and my dad, and a reminder that my culture asks me to be strong, and that helped me. So when one of my preceptors was really angry with me because I corrected her when she said something mean about a African American physician. So my preceptor's colleague was African American. My preceptor said something a bit odd, and I checked her a bit. I said, "What? I don't know if you're right about that." She got really angry with me, and she made my life difficult for the entirety of that rotation. But I didn't buckle, I didn't cry, I didn't complain. I remembered my dad saying, sometimes bad things will happen to you. You have to take it. Like, don't give up. Like, don't quit school because your preceptor gave you a bad mark or was mean to you. And so I remember him, and I thank him for those teachings. Next. And this is my friend Emmettuli, who's a Hawaiian physician on the island of Molokai. And you see how he's dressed. He's unapologetically Hawaiian. He sees other Hawaiians in his village. And he has adapted Western medicine so that it is more Hawaiian. And he's a hero of mine. When you're in Hawaii, you remember that Hawaiians used to be there, and you see people from all nations in Hawaii, and sometimes they use the healthcare system. And it's kind of cool when the healthcare workers in Hawaii have Hawaiian culture with them. Kind of cool. I went on sabbatical, and I helped out a little bit at their medical school. And I remember one day the Hawaiian medical students went out paddling because their studies took them away from their culture for long periods of time. And so the medical school, who had a number of Indigenous faculty, would take the Hawaiian students out and remind them who they were and where they were. Decolonizing was something that they talked about, and something that I hope we can talk about all the time. We live in a very beautiful part of the world. We're not in Donald Trump's America. We live in a place that's multicultural and pluralistic. We can be woke, we can be sophisticated, we can acknowledge Indigenous roots. We can say that the way that we used to do things in the 50s was a long time ago, and the way that we work now is completely different. We can be hip and modern and woke workers. And I just wanted to put a plug in here for the Indigenous Physicians Association of Canada. I know that Indigenous physicians are a link between Indigenous realities and physician realities, and that the discussions that happen amongst Indigenous physicians have been really helpful to me. And I hope that for all of you, you have those kinds of clusters and work environments and teammates and opportunities to gather and to evolve your ideas and evolve your acumen and grow your concepts so that you are challenged and confident and feeling really strong with where you find yourself. Fine. And here's a saying that kind of that is kind of similar to the teachings that I grew up with, and I try and share those wisdoms because there just aren't enough of us who talk about old kinds of wisdom or old kinds of inheritances or Indigenous knowledges. When your time comes to die, be not like those whose hearts are filled with fear of death, so that when their time comes, they weep and pray for a little more time to live their lives over again in a different way. Instead, sing your death song and die like a hero, going home. And really, it's just very simple about, your life is now. Have no regrets. Please be able to look back on your time as a worker and hold your head up high as having been someone who was fierce and honest and did your very, very best instead of bringing toxicity and laziness to the place. Go to the next slide. Almost done. What I used to tell Indigenous medical students was that education was like a sacred cow. You want the milk and not the horns. I was never a farm boy. Someone told me cows don't really have horns sometimes. I don't know, but the saying is you want the milk and not the horns. And in our education, what I'm learning now, in our workplace, we want the milk, not the horns. So please watch out for yourselves out there. I hope it's safe for you. And if it's not safe, I hope you make it safe. Bye. We simply must do better. The system has its problems. We need better standards. We need anti-racism knowledge, anti-racism skills, anti-racism attitudes, without a doubt. And it starts with the individual. We can make a difference. We can speak up. You have permission. Do better. Ask for better. Just a reminder, and I hope you've talked about this a lot today. Talk about racism, name stereotypes, gather data, examine why and where harms occur, reflect on your practice, our practice, and reflect on the workplace culture. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Evan. That was an amazing presentation and perfectly wraps up the discussions that we've been having over these past 3 days. Yesterday, we had a presentation from Cindy Blackstock where she talked about having the moral courage. And I was reminded of that when you were talking about how silence is complicit, and we need to have the moral courage to be able to stand up and speak out when it's really hard to do so. And I think that, you know, that common thread comes across with what we've seen happen with Joyce and what we've seen happen in so many different situations. So I wonder if you have advice for people on those times when it is really hard to speak up and have that moral courage, and how can we support each other and learn how to do better and be brave in those scenarios?
What I'm learning is that it actually does more damage to you to not speak up. So it's better to be brave and to be authentic and to do what's right. To not step up or to be scared or to not do the right thing, to appear complicit or actually be complicit, to be wrong, to be weak, to be silenced, feels terrible. So I feel like the urge now to speak up is quite natural, especially as I kind of empower myself and I disentangle myself from the status quo. You know, when I learn that, you know, this work environment isn't so sacred that I can't say, why are you talking like that to my colleague? So I hope that helps you. I hope that helps you.
Yeah, and one of the questions that came up was, you know, as someone typed, how to be better connected as a racialized person, but not as an Indigenous person, as an ally. So how people can begin working more towards allyship in this work.
I have had some extraordinary allies in my life, and I'm sure all of you have as well, that the standard for non-Indigenous peoples can be phenomenally high. I'm thinking of Bonnie Henry. Bonnie Henry and I were deputies together. She's extraordinary. And so when I meet a dumb medical student who's like, why do we have to learn about Indigenous health? I remember Bonnie, and I say, please try and be Bonnie, and not, you know, down there with your simplistic notions. And I think it's really fun being a good ally. You know, I try and be a good ally to straight people. You know, I try not to disempower them in their relationships. I try and be a good ally to women. I try and be a good ally to young people and not be condescending or flippant with them. It's very hard work, and yeah, sometimes you're going to be awful at it. Yeah, but you got to get up again and try again. I guess it's a bit like being in a marriage. Like, if you weren't so nice last night, you have today. Try a bit harder. Try a bit harder today. To bring your A game. That's it. Sports analogy.
Yeah, one of the things that your talk got me thinking about was, you know, I thought back to when you were talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and when that was happening. I thought back to a time in, I gotta say, maybe the mid 2000s. I was in a class, a university class in psychology, and the class was called Social Inequalities. And people started talking in the class and having a discussion around the residential school settlements. And I was sort of the Indigenous student in the corner, not saying too much in this discussion. And a woman puts up her hand, and she's a downtown East Side nurse. And she said, I just don't understand why we're giving all of these people this money when they're all just going to spend it on drugs. And I waited for the professor to intervene. I waited for other students to intervene, and nobody intervened. So I ended up having to intervene and correct this person. But this was a nurse who was serving our people and who was serving patients and clients on the downtown east side of Vancouver. So there's part of me that has been thinking that so much has changed since then. We have all of these frameworks, we have all of this cultural safety work, which didn't exist at that time. It wasn't really on people's radar at that time. And yet we still have cases like Joyce happening. So on the one hand, I can see how far we have come over all of these years in this dialogue, and that, you know, I don't know whether if someone made a comment like that in a class, whether other allies would jump in and intervene and have more of an educated opinion on the matter at this point in time in 2020. So I believe so, I would like to believe so, but also we have Joyce. And so I wonder if you have thoughts on, you know, despite making a lot of progress in so many different ways, what are we missing? And what is needed to take us that next step so that we can prevent things like Joyce from happening again?
And I'm still trying to find the words for what happened to Joyce, or my reaction to what happened to Joyce. And it was a nurse who was fired. And Canada has, I think, close to 100,000 nurses. And in Indigenous communities, nurses do most of the high-level work. There are some extraordinary nurses. And the Indigenous Nurses Association of Canada, or the Canadian Indigenous Nurses Association, apologized to her family. On behalf of their profession, they said, we were hurt ourselves that a nurse would do this. And because it wasn't a physician who did it this time, because usually I hear physician complaints, or I help with physician complaints, is that I could look at it maybe a little less defensively and say, well, of course, of 100,000 workers, there's bound to be one, maybe more, who's going to, bring her worst self on a day, make a horrendous judgment call, be racist, be incompetent or unsafe. Like, it's conceivable. And then you can go further and say, what part of her is a product of her society, or a product of her training, or her family, or her school? And what were nurses trained like in the 50s, the 1930s, and all of our professions for us, the doctors who came 2 generations ago, participated in a system that was unequal. And so that brings it back to us. How much are we active participants in inequities, our professions? How much do we own what that nurse did? And how much are we going to do about what that nurse did? What does that nurse's action mean? Us in our profession, us in our practice. So I think those are very important questions to ask, but they make people uncomfortable. And someone said today, I demand to be comfortable in my profession. I don't like being questioned about what a nurse did in Quebec. How dare you make me feel uneasy about my good work? And I said, and I didn't say, all I could think was, yeah, we all have to consent to being uncomfortable and looking inward and saying, what I have done? What is my profession honestly doing or not doing? And we make it better.
Yeah, and one of the things that Cindy pointed out as well is for us to consider, what are we willing to put on the line to do the right thing in a certain situation?
we were asked as Indigenous physicians, there were several in the room, which of us would speak to the media. And lots of us were scared. Lots of us said, if I'm quoted on Facebook or on Twitter being critical of the healthcare system or the government, I could pay very sharply for that. And then there was me who was saying, I'll do it. I'm confident with my speaking points. I want to talk about this. I don't mind stumbling around and fool myself or saying something that's half-baked. Like, someone's got to talk about it. So anyway, I do thank the audience for indulging me today. It really is a privilege to let me lurch around with these many ideas. It is meant to be helpful, not just an exercise for me. It was absolutely intended to try and help you evolve your ideas and get to a better, stronger place.
Well, it's a privilege for us to get to listen to you today. And thank you for sharing your experiences. I really think it was important also how you touched on the experiences of being an Indigenous staff member, being an Indigenous student or physician, and what that's like and how that bears a different burden on people than just being a patient or part of the system. So
yes, I hope that will be part of our dialogues. I hope we'll talk about our Indigenous colleagues more and more and more. Yes.
Well, thank you so much for being with us. And I'm sure I echo the audience that it was a very informative and amazing talk. So thanks again.
Take care, everyone.